Hi everyone, welcome. I'm about to head down into my wormery to feed some worms, but before I do, I figured I'd really quick check in on my spreadsheet here, my tracking spreadsheet, to show which bins I've got in mind for a feeding today. I've just got so much stuff piling up in the refrigerator, it's time to make space in the freezer and clear out some of the food that's been set aside for these little guys. So the bins that are on target for getting feeding today are, number one is the VERMIBAG Mini with the European night crawlers. Been 8 days since that bin was fed. Down here, 7 days since my my two red wiggler bins that have what I estimate to be 5,000 worms in them. It's been a week since those were fed. And down here, it shows 6 days on my newest bin, which is also red wigglers. But that wasn't really a formal feeding. I just treated that as a feeding because when I bought the worms over, in that case, it did seem to me as if a fair bit of food was coming over with the worms. So I kind of treated it as a feeding, but it wasn't a lot of food. And even over here on my tracker, you can see that counted as feeding number 2. And the initial feeding, feeding number 1, was really the food that was placed into the bin when it was originally built. And this bin, I estimate to have 2,000 worms in it. So that one seems like it's due for a feeding as well. And then after I get done, that's when I'll usually come back in here and I'll update the spreadsheet to show when the new feeding occurred and all that other stuff. But before we headed down there, I just figured really quick I'd show what my game plan was. So why don't we grab some food from the freezer and head on down to the wormery and get these guys fed. So down here in my wormery, here's where you can see the bins that I was talking about earlier. You can also see some empty containers down there. Those obviously aren't on the hit list today. It's all those that you see with coverings on top of them. The VERMIBAG Mini on the right. The two bins with the 5,000 in them each is up here on top, and then the newest of my bins down here with the estimated 2,000 worms in it on the bottom. All right, let's get started. I think we'll start with the newest of my bins here. Plastic covering over this bin, I had suspected to possibly be the reason I was noticing some flying insects hanging out around here. And I had actually talked about removing this plastic from the cardboard or just using a different piece of plastic to cover up with. I guess it might be time to put a glove on here. You could see the you can see this covering paper that was placed right over the material in the bin, which rests right between the contents of the bin and the plastic is where all the moisture gets trapped and deposited once it starts to accumulate. And the worms really go to town on it when it's right there and constantly soaked. So this piece, for example, might just be best served as bedding at this point going forward. This piece is still doing pretty good, but if I want to continue with keeping coverings over the top this way, then I might need to get myself a fresh piece of paper. This piece of paper has been kind of serving as the feeding zone indicator, even though this newest of my bins, in my mind, hasn't really even received any formal feedings. This should be its real first formal feeding. Just interesting to see how many little baby worms are hanging out on the surface of this piece of paper. Some of them are really, really small. I mean, I don't even know if they're going to show up on the camera unless they're moving. Maybe that one's visible now. But it's pretty cool how they all seem to come to the surface looking for the moisture, and I guess they stumble on this piece of paper and find it a cozy place to be. But that seems to be a pretty good sign, you know. I think I'm going to get a glove on so we can really get down into here and start feeding. Well, you know, before we get started, I think I'm just going to remove a couple of these things so they're not in our way. Now, this is my newest bin. Like I said, the first feeding on my spreadsheet was the material that I originally built the bin with, and the way I did that was I positioned food all over the place. The second feeding on the list is really stuff that came along with the worms. So when I dumped in the pile of worms that had been moved over from another bin, it included food that they'd been occupying and were eating at the time. And that would have been kind of down the middle over here. But I don't think we're going to see a real concentration of worms the way we normally do in my bins, because in my other bins I usually feed in one particular place. We can always go back to that place to see a pretty good number of worms hanging out. But in here I don't really expect to see that sort of a tight concentration of worms in any one given spot, but who knows. This will be our first real venture down into this bin to see how it's coming along. At first, sometimes I think to myself, oh great, look at all these castings. And then I have to remind myself that the majority of the castings I'm probably seeing this early in the game are most likely castings that probably came over with the worms from their previous space. But it does seem like we've got a pretty nice environment in here. The moisture seems really good. Lots of worms hanging out down low. That plastic covering things I think really helps a lot too, especially in the beginning, you know, when the bin consists of a lot of dry materials, whatever the bin was built with. You can see a lot of cardboard bits, a lot of leafy matter. That stuff I always worry is going to lead to excessive dryness in the bin early on. And until such a time that I've got a greater number of castings in the bin, which I know really hold on to moisture nicely, I prefer to start out with plastic coverings, at least more lately. And then gradually, as I start to sense that the material is starting to really take on a lot more moisture, I might gravitate away from using the plastic coverings. So I'm just taking a quick peek over here on the outer edges too, you know, as long as I'm here. This is my real first venture down into this bin to see how things look. And so far I really like what I'm seeing. I had anticipated 2,000 worms being in this bin. And I would almost have to say that that sounds about right. Seems like a good approximation on the number of worms in this bin. A bin this size definitely works well with a couple thousand worms. I guess that would equate to maybe 2 pounds of worms. And they're pretty much all over the place. But I think after we start feeding, after we place in this first feeding, and it's going to be centralized in the middle, I think the worms are going to start making their way over to it. And the next time we come in here, we might see a greater concentration of worms right down the middle. Digging a little ditch to place the food into, but I just don't have a lot of material to dig down into. I'm going to use a little bit of this material that we've been covering up with previously. This should work well as sort of a base for our food, a little bedding on the bottom. I'm also going to use pieces of newspaper to encapsulate the food that I'm giving them today. So I like the idea in the beginning at least to make sure there's a good healthy supply of bedding for these little guys, as well as a carbon-rich food source. So I'm going to, I think I should really be thinking that way for all of my bins at all stages of their life cycle. But in the very beginning, it does seem like giving them plenty of bedding is a good idea. So I'm going to include their feeding with some built-in bedding and carbon food source right there. This way I won't feel so bad if I'm unable to do a good thorough job covering it, because I'll know that it's already covered right there with the paper. From the look of it, I've probably got enough food allocated for these guys to equate to maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 handfuls. I guess here's what I've set aside for them. So in addition to what's already been placed in there, I think we've got enough to fill up maybe 2 more of these little newspaper rolls. I keep finding these labels. Oh, this is because it's on the apple. The apple I got from my brother-in-law's mom sent over a bunch of apple peels. So I guess I'm going to have to be careful to make sure I don't load up my bins with a bunch of plastic. Whatever. It'll come out in the wash. I can't seem to get it off, but I'll eventually be able to once the worms strip away the food from it. I've been seeing a few people adopting this method of bundling the food into their little rolls like this. And I like the idea because it kind of forces the topic of, carbon balance in their food and bedding, and it doesn't really let you skimp or skip. If you're going to be making these little food rolls for the worms, then you know right away you're also going to be including a carbon food source to go along with their nitrogen-rich kitchen scraps. I'm also going to include some grit over here, a little bit of pulverized eggshell, as well as a little top coating of coffee. So I think I could use some of this leafy material we saw out on the outer edges to start covering up with. But I've also got my box full of fresh leaves that we can dump on top as well. And that's also going to serve as a good bedding material for the worms, as well as a top cover for the feeding. So let's give them a little bit of that. Oh, I'm almost out of leaves down here. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Definitely like the way things look in this bin. The material seems really nice. And I think in terms of top coverings now, I'm going to be able to just go with tradition and use my coffee filter as the main indicator to show where the food source is. And I guess just as a double whammy, we'll go ahead and we'll throw this piece on top of it, since the worms really do seem to enjoy having a place to come and hang out on top of, underneath the plastic where all the moisture collects. And I'm sure we're going to see a great deal more deterioration on this piece of paper next time we check in here. But this is a pretty generous feeding, I gotta say, for such a young bin with so few worms. So this feeding might not require us to check in for at least another week, maybe 10 days. So I feel pretty good about this bin being in good shape for a little bit longer than normal, since that was a pretty generous feeding we just gave them. So now, even though last time I had made mention of the fact that I might just be getting rid of this cardboard that's covered in plastic, since I was growing suspicious that it might be the reason I was seeing flying insects, I didn't really see too many in here today. I mean, I did see a couple when we first started, but it didn't seem like it was becoming chronic, so I'm going to stick with this for a little while longer and see how it goes. Alright, let's get on to one of our 5,000 count worm bins. Now here's what I set aside for the next bin. Apple, peach, I believe. I don't know what this is, some sort of the end of a vegetable. This looks like the stem, some carrots, some corn, lettuce, all kinds of yummy stuff. Alright, slightly larger bin. Let's see if we can give ourselves a little better view. Here I'm already down to the point where I'm covering only with paper. It was starting to seem like the moisture level was starting to rise in this bin, so I removed the plastic coverings that had been on here in the beginning. It seems like it's doing a really nice job, and the castings themselves do a really nice job retaining the moisture too. So that's when you start to worry a little bit less, as long as you've got mainly castings at some point. They hold moisture so well that a little thin sheet of paper does great maintaining the moisture level. But the one thing that's different though, since there's no plastic and there's no real thick concentration of moisture right there at the surface, you just don't see quite the number of worms hanging out right on the surface the way you do on bins where there is plastic covering the top. So that's the one difference. Not as much worm eye candy. Okay, so I'm going to just dig a trench down the middle. We can add more food. The material is pretty damp, but then again, we've got to remember we're right where the feedings had been. So whatever food had been placed in here last time, it would have been thawing. Since it had been frozen, it would be emitting a fair bit of moisture. So the material right down the middle is typically going to be pretty damp. Look at all these worms hanging out. Just a worm ball. It's so cool how they squirm in your hand. Move them aside. Since the food we're giving them is frozen, I don't want to shock them by placing it right on top. I'm seeing scraps of previous feedings. I'm a little surprised to see such a big piece of melon remaining. It's got a little bit of a stink to it. Usually when you open up your worm bin, you start feeding, you don't really smell anything. Sometimes you would expect to smell the odor of the food that you've given them. But usually there's no sign of that. It's usually an earthy kind of a fresh smell, kind of like a forest floor. But here I'm definitely smelling a little bit of funkiness. I wonder why. It's not a smell that I really recognize. It almost smells like a, I don't know, it's kind of a gross idea, but if you can imagine the smell of somebody who hasn't used deodorant, if you know what I mean. That kind of really pungent, kind of BO smell. I know it's not me, that's for sure. It was the moment I peeled back the material in the bin was when I started sensing it. A little bit weird. Hopefully it'll go away. So I usually don't panic when I just see one little anomaly. I'll usually kind of put it on the watch list and start you know, trying to be a little bit more vigilant to see what the deal is and check in on it to see what's becoming of that situation. But I'm just going to assume it was just the smell of one of the food items they received last time, since it's not yet completely broken down. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Let's knock some of these little worms off my hands. Okay. And let's get to feeding. Some of these things are pretty much frozen into a single chunk, so all the carrots are going to go in together, as well as some apple, and some corn. That's a pretty good size little bundle there. I think here too we're going to fit about 3 of these. Seems like we should have space for it. I think in the past I've been using sort of a measure that equates to a handful or 2 at a time. Actually, I think it was 2 was the number I was sort of going by, like 2 good, generous handfuls of food. But I think what I've kind of got going on here today is more along the lines of maybe 3 pretty large, generous handfuls of food. But I think that should be fine, especially in these bins with the greater number of worms in them. And there's still a bunch of leftover food in here too from previous feedings. So I think this bin should do pretty good for a while. I think we're just going to take whatever's left in this tray here and pour it over. And we've got ourselves 3 pretty equal size bundles of food over here, complete with bedding material, with paper. And I think I'm just going to see what I could do about collecting some of these older food bits that we encountered on our way down to get them down in here before we start backfilling the hole. I always just prefer to have their food somewhere below the surface. I don't want to have their food right out on the top and have it as a potential attractor for any sort of maybe flying insects or whatever creatures might make their way into my wormery looking for a handout. I prefer to keep this as food meant for the worms, not for bugs. I'm kind of trying to see if I can zero in on whatever it is that was making that pungent odor. I wonder if it could have been the cantaloupe. It's a very foreign smell. Like I said, the only thing it reminded me of was kind of like a really bad case of body odor. So I wonder if anyone else out there has ever sensed that in their bins after pulling out some food that had been in there for a week or more. Or if it's something other than the food, that'll be good to know as well. So if you've ever experienced that in your bins, please let me know. I've never smelled that before. That was kind of a new thing for me. So I think we've got the majority of the food that we found on our way down relocated back down into the feeding area. I'm just trying to backfill the hole pretty thoroughly so we don't leave any of the food exposed. Although, you know what? Just by saying that, it reminded me. I guess we are going to leave some of the food exposed because I've got some coffee that I want to put on here, but whatever, I'm not going to dig it up. I guess we are going to have a little bit of food that's going to be exposed right to the surface, but it's coffee, which I don't really see as being something that attracts pests. So I'm not too worried about that being on the top surface. So we'll just sprinkle a portion of that across the top. I'll try to save a little bit for my other bins too. I'm not sure why, but I always feel like I've got this compulsion to evenly distribute the foods that I'm giving them. So if I bring down some coffee, it seems like I want to make sure everyone gets a fair shake at getting some of it. I'm sure the worms don't care one way or another. But that looks pretty good. Nice active population in here. We didn't really go rummaging around the sides this time. I don't want to spend all day down here. I just want to get these guys fed. So let's move on to the next one. Oh, almost forgot the cover. Let's get that in there. All right, this is number 2. Bin number 2 that we believe to have approximately 5,000 worms in it. Even though I've been trying to maintain this bin as well as the last bin we just fed sort of equally, this one is clearly different with the fact that it's got all these leaves on top. The leaves are attempting to suck up extra moisture because despite my efforts to keep them similar to one another in terms of being fed and maintained very similarly, this bin, for whatever reason, seemed like it started getting way more damp than the other one. So I used a lot of leafy matter, a lot of dry stuff in here last time to try to soak up some of the moisture, so we'll see how that's helping us. And the other thing, since maybe because it was a lot more moisture in here, it did seem like this bin was working its way through its food a lot more quickly than the other one. So I did set aside a very similar feeding, again, with the apple and corn and lettuce and carrots. Very similar to what we just gave the other bin, but quantity-wise, it's just a little bit more. Because I believe that this bin was somehow consuming a little bit more food. So we'll see how we're doing as far as leftovers from the previous feeding. I'm going to collect all of this dry leafy stuff off the surface and temporarily set it aside so that we can reuse it at the end to cover up with. I have a little bit more in my box that I've held on to just in case we feel that we need a little bit more. So here too, similar to what we had in the other bin, I was using this piece of paper to cover up where we last fed. Not so much cover up, but more to just indicate where we had last fed, which was down the middle in most cases in my bins. I tend to feed down the middle. Okay, I think I've removed enough. Let's remove this as well. We'll put all this stuff right back on top after we're finished. So let's see how things are looking in here. I think I will probe around a little bit more than I did in the other one, mainly to see how the moisture situation's progressing. So I still feel like it just somehow seems more damp than I would like it to be. Although maybe I'm just imagining things, because look, it does flake apart very readily. I mean, it is damp, it's cool, and it's really not that bad, come to think of it. I mean, I just don't want it to get any worse than it had been. I mean, okay, here it is. This is what I don't like to see, is when it starts to get clumpy like this. To me, that just seems a little bit more muddy than it needs to be. I don't feel it getting any worse. Definitely seems better than it had been, because it was like that all over the place. Let's take another sample from this side and see how things look. I mean, it is full of all kinds of loose matter, but for the most part it is crumbling apart pretty nicely. Here too, I don't know if I'm just finding a piece of something that it's all stuck to, and that's what I'm perceiving as clumping. This might actually be a stem of a banana hidden underneath some compost, but yeah, all that compost stuck to it. I don't know, maybe we're doing okay here. Maybe I don't have to be too paranoid about it quite yet. It doesn't seem like it's getting any worse than it had been. Maybe it's just a slow recovery. I've gotten a lot of great suggestions on how to cope with the dampness. But for now, I think I'm going to not sweat it so much. I'm going to treat this as being kind of on the road to recovery with the removal of the plastic that had been covering it, as well as removal of some cardboard that had been covering it. And just leaving that one piece of paper on top is probably helping a lot so that the bin can actually kick off some of its excess moisture if it needs to. Definitely a pretty heavily populated bin if you look around through it. The material on this side seems pretty decent too, nice and flaky. Here and there, maybe just a little bit muddy. So I think I'm just going to stick to what I'm doing here. It feels like it's not getting worse. It feels like it might actually be getting a little bit better. So I'm going to assume that what I'm doing now is helping. I just don't want to start getting, overly anxious or reacting too much in a knee-jerk kind of way. I like to kind of assume that the measures that I'm taking are effective, and maybe I just need to give myself a little bit of time to get to the results that I'm hoping for. Alright, so the last feeding we gave this bin should have been right down the middle. So even though we've already seen a fair number of worms hanging out in this bin, I would hope to see more down the middle. So yeah, this bin also includes a fair bit of slow composting food items like mango seeds, which I've been either hacking in half. You could see half of it was just cut off here. Here's the stem of a pumpkin. It's pretty much wood if you think of it. So that's something like that's going to certainly take time to break down. Mango seeds, I'm pretty sure there's a number of them in here. Those things you would definitely expect to continue to see in here week after week over time. It's more if we're going to see signs of the more easily eaten stuff that we gave them last time. This also, the stem of a banana, slow composting item. Not too slow, but a little bit slower than the rest of the banana peel itself. Another mango pit. So it's not those things that I was referring to in terms of the food that they get being gobbled up completely from the last go around. Here too, avocado seed. Definitely can't expect that to break down quickly. So with the exception of those slow composting items that we've picked out of here, I'm definitely not seeing any signs of any other food that was given to this bin last time. Like in the other bin, we definitely saw a fair bit of remaining cantaloupe rind. That would have also been fed to this bin too, I believe, because I believe that they've been getting fairly comparable feedings. But for whatever reason, it does seem like this bin has been able to do away with the food that it gets a lot more quickly than the other one. I was already theorizing that maybe I've just got a larger worm population in here. And they really like hanging out at the bottom. And now I think we're actually coming up on some of the food items they'd received last time. These are the rinds of the cantaloupe. And now I'm smelling it again. That's definitely cantaloupe that we were smelling, I guess. Here too, I'm kind of surprised they didn't do away with all of it, but it does seem like they did away with the majority of it. There's a little bit of fleshy material remaining on those pieces of cantaloupe rind, but it does seem like for the most part they managed to strip it clean. This one actually has a fair bit of material still on it too. Phew, I didn't realize cantaloupe gets so stinky when it's down in your worm bin. Well, whatever. I'm still going to stick to giving them that nice generous feeding that I've set aside for them. I don't think it's going to be a problem. I just hope I don't smell this stink in here next time we come in here. It is pretty pungent. But like I said, it's something I normally don't experience in my bins, so maybe it was just something about that cantaloupe. And I'm assuming I don't have to react to it, other than what you're hearing me say. I'm assuming that next time we come in here, we're not going to sense it anymore. All right, I've piled things pretty high here to give ourselves space to drop in this feeding. So let's grab some food. Here too, I'm going to try to fit it into three of these bundles, but I'm going to make them pretty large in size. This one is all frozen together for the most part. Let's see if I can add some of this loose apple to it. Even a little bit of corn. Pretty good sized bundle. Bundle number 2, we're going to throw in some of this lettuce, more of the corn, some of the apple. I think the majority of, I think what remains should fit into one more of these paper bundles. So I'm just going to pour off whatever remains into this piece of paper. Almost forgot this piece of lettuce. This should make for another pretty large size bundle. Quite a generous feeding, I must say. So here too, I feel like I might not have to worry about this bin for a while. So let's see if we can do things a little differently here by not forgetting the grit. I throw that in right away so I don't forget. I guess we could start returning a lot of this food stuff that we stumbled across on our way down. Place it right on top of the fresh food. And all these slow composting items. Here's a peach pit. All very slow composting items, which at this rate might outlive this bin. With this many worms, it wouldn't be surprising, especially with, you know, large feedings like this too. It wouldn't be surprising to get to the finish line with this pretty soon. And then at some point feeling like there's no way that those large, slow composting items will ever break down in time for us to be able to consider harvesting the bin. So that material might eventually just need to be plucked out and used to set up yet another new bin elsewhere, so that we can actually give this bin a chance to start winding down and be prepped for harvesting. Oops, you know what? I'm almost forgetting another thing. So before we close up shop down here in this feeding zone, let's make sure we give them a little bit of this coffee too. It's quite a bit. I want to save some for the VERMIBAG, so the European night crawlers get a bit as well. So we'll just return everything to the top here and get things covered up again. Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't think I should really worry too much about moisture in this bin anymore, because I do think that the stuff feels nice and loose and flaky. It should be fine. I mean, naturally I'll be watching it closely, and I'll be putting all those dry leaves back on top again. Right now I'm just more curious if we're going to hopefully eliminate that stinky locker room smell from my bins by the next time we get back to them. Wow, so close to the top already. A lot of times I just like to use the bin's capacity as my measure for when to start, you know, start gearing up for migration. And maybe extracting all of those slow composting food items to do something else with them, to maybe start another bin, might be a good idea too. You know, give that stuff a chance to be broken down by the worms, even if it can't get done in the time it takes for a single bin to get from start to finish. All right. On to the last feeding, which is the VERMIBAG with the European night crawlers. Down here in the VERMIBAG Mini, I've been continuing with this piece of cardboard covered with diatomaceous earth, trying to combat the flying insects. And this piece of plastic has also been doing a nice job, I think, covering things up. Down here we can see some of the worms hanging out, and we got a pretty good amount of leafy matter scattered across the top. The idea here was not so much for absorbing moisture, but more to conceal the food that gets placed in here for the worms by covering it, in the hopes that maybe that would deter some of the flying insects from trying to come in here to take advantage of the food. But then again, who knows? Maybe they're just coming to take advantage of something else and it's not the food. Maybe they'll just like the coverings, or they like crawling in under the cardboard or something. It's kind of a mystery. But here I've got that really nice earthy smell in this bin. The smell that you would expect to encounter when you open up your worm bin. Just like walking through the forest, you know, such a nice fresh smell. Such an unusual thing. So many people question, hey, what's that smell like? It must stink. And it's like, no, quite the opposite actually. So we're seeing a worm here and there, but somehow these night crawlers don't seem to bundle together the way you'll see the red wigglers do, like we saw in the previous bins. Those were all red wigglers, and these are night crawlers. These night crawlers received a whole bunch of corn cob, and you could see some of it right here. The corn cob had been sliced into little discs, so rather than throwing the entire cob in whole, I chopped each one into numerous little round discs. And I believe it's been about, 30 some odd days, maybe around 35 days at this point, almost, that, and that would be 5 weeks, right? So about almost 5 weeks, I guess, since these corn cobs were placed in here. And if they were just placed in whole, here's a mango seed. Mango seed always seems to have a lot of action inside. The worm's working it out. But these corn cobs, if they'd not been transformed into little tiny pieces like that, and they were just placed in whole, then I bet they wouldn't even show any signs yet of decomposition. These are avocado seeds. This bin also has a few of these slow composting items in here. But I think the majority of what I'm going to keep encountering are a lot of these little discs of the corn cob. But they're already broken down so far that they barely remain intact. So that's always a great sign that they're getting broken down that far. Another mango seed. So let's just make some space down here for these little guys to get their next feeding. I think now we're probably starting to see some signs of the previous feedings now. Usually I'll put it down pretty low. And here too, I guess we're going to be probably going to be creating a couple of these paper rolls for them to get their food sort of bundled into a little burrito. And if we could fit 3 of them in here like we did in the other bins, then I'm going to need a little bit more space. So I'm trying to open up a nice big hole for them. And I'm encountering all kinds of, slow composting food items, as well as some more of these corn cob rings at this point. A lot of them have had their inside portions of them consumed already, and now they're just eating the outer portions, leaving sort of a ring-shaped piece of corn cob at this point. The material down low is pretty damp. I've never harvested this bin yet. I'm definitely curious to see how that's going to go at some point in the future. As we work our way down, we can see a lot more worms. So I think this is probably a good depth for us to place this feeding. Okay, so here too I'm going to be using a piece of newspaper into which we're going to put the food. Here's a piece of cucumber. Here's a radish. I think this might be strawberry. Cucumber peelings. I don't want to go overboard because I'm expecting to wrap 2 more of these. I want to leave enough to fill up 2 more pieces of paper. Pretty generous feeding, I think. Maybe a little bit more than usual. In the past, or at least recently, I've been giving the worms portions that are probably equivalent to about 2 good large handfuls. But I believe what I've been giving them here today is closer to maybe 3 handfuls. So maybe 50% more than they've been getting lately. This is a mango seed. And I'm not going to put this in. I'm going to actually set this aside, and before I put it in, I'm going to make sure I cut it in half, or at least put a big opening in it, or at least some holes. Because just putting it in a hole like this, it would probably go nowhere fast, so I don't want to waste my time with that. So maybe we'll make a slightly smaller roll here, and we'll have another similarly sized roll for number 3. Alright, I'll just pour it all in here, and like I said, remove this mango seed and give it to them later after I've opened it up and made it a little bit easier for them to get at it. Right. Looks like a nice hearty feeding. So throw a little bit of crushed eggshell on there, as well as what remains of our coffee that we bought down here for these little guys. And then if I can, I'll try to find some of these slow composting food items that we pulled out earlier to try to get them down there with the rest of the food as well. If I remember correctly, they're somewhere over here in this corner for the majority of them. Mango seeds for the most part. But they'll break it down in time. You can see they're all over it. It just takes time. You got to be patient. There's a bunch of corn over here too, I believe. A little pile of it over here. Let's get that back in. Okay, I think we're pretty good here. I can start scattering some of this leafy material around the top, and in my box I still have enough to give this thing a nice coating across the top. So why don't I use what remains to try to create a little bit of a buffer between the food and the air. Try to minimize the temptation in here. It's not much, but I'll take it. And maybe that's something else I could do, is reload my box and come back in here and supplement this leaf topping for them. So that's pretty much where we stand today. I spent a little bit more time down here than I thought I would, but it's always fun and I don't mind. So if you made it this far, then I really appreciate it. That's really awesome. I sometimes feel like I spend a little bit more time here than I should, and I don't get a lot of complaints about it, so I'm, you know, hopefully not losing too many people along the way. So let me just leave it at that. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your company. If you enjoyed the video, hope you did, then please don't forget to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.